Yes, indeed. Welcome to the show. This is the place where we recover the classical and biblical roots of America and the West, one conversation at a time. The surge of violence and death, even at public rallies, such as what we saw recently in Charlottesville, Virginia, have really exposed a deep level of racial and political hatred in this country. Debate seems far in the past. Nowadays, the degree of vitriol and polarization are at an all-time high, and some people are talking about maybe a coming civil war. Our guest today is a former white supremacist, leader of the National Front in England. He did jail time on more than one occasion, and he knows firsthand from the inside out what intense race hatred feels like. Joseph Pearce is senior editor at the Augustine Institute. He's the senior fellow and journal editor at the Cardinal Newman Society, and Tolkien and Lewis Chair in Literary Studies at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. You've probably seen him on EWTN or read one of his books. His acclaimed book titles include, now here I have to shorten it because it's a long list, Tolkien, Man and Myth, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde, C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church. His spiritual autobiography is called Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. Joseph Pearce joins us from his otherwise blissful vacation location somewhere between Vancouver and Tijuana. Joseph, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be with you, Patrick.
I don't know if people who know you from EWTN and your books know about your past, your English National Front Bulldog editorial street brawl past. Do you ever take almost a dreamy look from 10,000 feet at the story of your life and how unlikely it is that you and I are talking right now and that you got out of all of that?
Well, you know, it's been a long journey, but I don't really think you can ever sort of become disembodied from it and look at it from 10,000 feet. I think that I like the analogy of Malcolm Muggeridge, the writer Malcolm Muggeridge, who became a Catholic, I think, when he was 78 years old in 1982. And he talked about his journey. He said that although he did many bad things, in his case it was quite frankly serial fornication, cheating with his wife on numerous occasions. But he said, of course, he regretted all aspects of his past that had caused harm to others, but he couldn't regret the journey because the journey had brought him to the foot of the cross. So that's the real analogy, because basically that past me is still me, if you see what I mean. I'm not separate from it, but thanks be to God, by the grace of God, I've moved beyond that hatred that I once felt towards my fellow man, and by the grace of God, I'm now able to love my neighbor and indeed to love my enemy.
I'm thinking of, as you were talking about St. Paul, who had a murderous impulse, certainly participated in the stoning of Stephen. St. Augustine had his, his passion, his fire, and it's almost like the Holy Spirit doesn't create a new structure, but renews the structure that he works with. And so the you inside you, there's a sort of a continuity, although it's, obviously baptized and kind of cleansed. But you are unusually, let me just apply a sufficient layer of butter here, okay, Joseph? You're not only prolific, but your writing is so elegant. It's so well, if you were speaking, it would be mellifluous, is probably the right word. But that comes from that engine in you, right? That kind of, you're tapping into the same engine, as it were, as you did when you were editing The Bulldog and going to prison and all manner of dark deeds.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate and observe your mechanistic, almost materialistic use of metaphor engine. I prefer to use biblical terms such as talents or gifts or grace. Basically, God gave me the gift to communicate with words, and I've always been good at it. The point is, of course, do you use that gift in a way which is in accordance with the will of the giver of the gift, God, or do you use that gift in defiance of the giver of the gift? And certainly, largely through ignorance, not through deliberately turning away from Him. God was irrelevant to me. I was an agnostic. He wasn't even important enough for me to become an atheist. I was an agnostic because He was not part of my life. He was not important. So obviously I didn't use my gifts in the manner in which they were given to me to be used, but by the grace of God, through my conversion, obviously I've been able to rectify some of the harm I did by using my words for hatred when I was younger, by now hoping to spread the gospel of love.
Did you find growing up that the relativism that you experienced in schools in England growing up in the 60s and 70s is now rather similar to the public school situation here in the United States today.
Emphatically. In fact, that I think is one of the root problems, that my education in the public school system back in England was basically secular fundamentalist and radical relativist. Words such as virtue were banned from the vocabulary. We weren't able to talk in terms of what's right and wrong in terms of moral behavior. It was a radical relativism, and the problem with that, of course, is that it privileges feeling over reason, and also privileges pride over humility. Now, when the whole of this course is based upon my feelings and my ego, we end up in a situation where I identify with what I want to identify with and hate people that don't accept or embrace that. It's no longer a question of trying to get to a truth that's beyond us. Truth is me, and if you disagree with me, I'm going to destroy you.
Do you find that, looking back at that relativism and how it shaped your mind and in a way was a guide to your decisions, that there was one exception to relativism, and that was the power of the state? Was the state the only standalone, capital O, objectivity? Because you couldn't, it was outside yourself, and it was a kind of substitute God. Does that make sense?
Yes, in actual fact, there was an irony here, because you think about neo-Nazis, and I have no great difficulty in describing myself as being a neo-Nazi in those days. I joined the National Front when I was 15, and I was involved in the movement for 11 years, going to prison twice for my political involvement. So I have no problem calling myself a neo-Nazi, but ironically, because the power of the state was used to crush me and my buddies, me and my comrades, in ways which, quite frankly, also broke the law. In other words, that the police knew that nobody sympathized with us, so they could do what they liked. One consequence of that was actually I began to sympathize with George Orwell's distrust or mistrust of the power of the state. And if you like, certain sort of libertarian tendencies came into my thinking. And of course, ironically, that led me away from the totalitarianism of the likes of Hitler, because, you know, if power tends to corrupt and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, then, you know, if we believe in the power of a big, powerful neo-Nazi state, it's going to become corrupt. So I began to sort of have more sympathy for ideas such as Chesterton's and Belloc's distributism, and Orwell's, if you like, mistrust of big government. And that was a consequence, basically, of seeing the hand of big government coming down heavily upon me when I chose to be a dissident. Now, my ideas were, of course, bad, right? But nonetheless, you know, I was a dissident voice and was crushed mercilessly by the power of the state.
Perhaps another irony in there is that the Nazis lost.
Well, yes. I mean, the point is that materialism loses in one sense, but it's always with us. It's, you know, that the whole of human history is a war between the power of pride and the power of humility, ultimately between the will of God and those who willingly and willfully defy the will of God. So we see throughout the whole of human history this tension between those who are trying to become holy, those who are trying to live the life of virtue, and those who are living selfishly and egocentrically, and they manifest themselves in secular politics. So secularism versus, if you like, the church is the running motif of the whole of human history in terms of politics, economics, and in many other ways. So what we see today is really something which we see in every generation. And we need to realize that, you know, otherwise we think that we're living in the worst of all times and things are getting worse. Well, we're living in bad times, and things do seem to be getting worse, but there have been worse times, and even after the worst of times, there's a resurrection. The church is never defeated. Materialism is also never defeated. It won't be till the end of time. It's if you like, a battle to the end of time between those two forces.
I never thought of that materialism as one of the tares, you know, threatening the wheat that you can't really uproot without destroying other good things.
Absolutely, and, you know, and it goes right back to the beginning. It goes right back to Genesis, that we have to choose between doing the will of God or self-deifying. And, you know, basically we live in a culture of relativism where the whole center of it is that there is no center except for yourself, right? Yeah. It's self-centered. And the problem with that, of course, is that we self-identify, join a tribe that has the same self-identity we have, and hate every other tribe.
Yeah. Did your neo-Nazi mindset set as a target Catholics? I know you remember the Order of Orange. Was it blacks, Jews, Catholics, Indians, anyone who wasn't a white Englishman? Sort of all of the above?
All of the above, exactly. I was very heavily involved with the anti-Catholic terrorist organizations in Northern Ireland. So I have a terrorist, associations. And so, yeah, I'm well aware of that, of religious hatred, religious bigotry. I also know, up to a point at least, where people that hate Catholicism come from, because I hated Catholicism myself. Although I'm reminded of the words of Bishop Fulton Sheen, who said that there are very few people in this country who actually disagree with Catholicism, but there are millions of people who disagree with what they think Catholicism is.
Mm-hmm. And you learned that, you said in a recent essay in National Catholic Register, reflecting on your past in light of the Charlottesville rally, which ended so badly, that you learned your racism somewhat from your father's knee. There was and because you touch on your relationship with your dad in the book, I sense a deep ambiguity there, that it did instill a lot of lovely things in you. There was a lot of goodness in the education you received, and yet there was this bad seed as well.
Yeah, and there was a lot of goodness in my father. One of the most difficult things about writing my book was to get the grips with my relationship with my father, and also get the grips, if you like, with the objective reality of who my father was. Because we're sometimes too close to the people we love to actually be able to make objective judgments. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the most difficult things. And there was a paradox, with my father, that he hated in the abstract, but actually loved in the concrete. In other words, every human being he met, he loved. He had a real sense of the dignity of the human person, and yet he could hate in the abstract. So he could want every single black person removed from England by whatever means were necessary. He could hate Catholics, but yeah, if he met a Catholic Irishman in a pub, he could laugh and joke with them. Work with black people, at work, and laugh and joke with them. He loved people, but he hated, if you like, hated other tribes. He had an idea of what England was, and part of what England was a white country, basically. Mm-hmm. And from that understanding or misunderstanding, everything else followed.
The term alt-right has shifted somewhat in its meaning. I've never had truck nor trade with the whole concept, because to me the fundamental flaw of the alt-right mentality is mistaking skin color and nationalism for civilization. I think those are very, very different things. Did you, when you were watching the footage of Charlottesville, you must have had pretty vivid sense of deja vu?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was actually at a rally back in 1979 in Southall, just to the west of London, where I was one of the speakers at the neo-Nazi rally, if you like, and the counter demonstration was riotous, and in that counter demonstration, one of the counter demonstrators was killed. So there's a direct parallel, although our members didn't actually physically drive into anybody. And another occasion, one of my own comrades, one of my own friends, was killed when he was struck on the head by counter demonstrators. So yeah, I've been in radical extremist street demonstrations that lead to the death of those involved. It was very much a very sad sense of deja vu.
You never killed?
I never killed anybody directly, thanks be to God, but I hate to think the effect that my hate speech and the incitement to racial hatred, that I was actually trying to incite racial hatred. I was trying to bring about a race war in order, in theory, for our movement to come to power out of the ashes of the multiracial society. Exactly the strategy we see with some of these alt-right groups today. So I know I'm always living, if you like, under the burden of the harm I've done to people in the past, and I have a fear that and a suspicion that will be part of my purgatorial experience, is to actually look at the damage I did face to face. But what a motivation to actually try to do as much good as I can in the time left to me.
Sure.
To make as many amends this side of death for the harm I did when I was an angry young man.
Right. Do you agree with me that Antifa and alt-right are almost, they're photo negatives of each other? It's a very similar worldview, just a few adjustments of political views, but the MO seems identical to me. Absolutely, and this is one of the big mistakes that Christians make, is that in their well, it can go in either direction, but in their antagonism
towards racism, they become fellow travelers with people who hate the church, who hate Christianity, who are supporters of pride, in order to fight a group that support pride. I mean, ultimately, what animates both groups is a sense of pride, a sense of antagonism towards humility and towards God. So that's a danger. And on the other extreme, there are people that hate communism so much that are tempted to sympathize with the alt-right because they see them as enemies of the enemy. But we know we've seen all this in history. We've seen it in history that people become fascist because they're opposed to communism in the 1920s and 1930s, or people become communists because they're opposed to fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. But at the end of the day, you know, Hitler killed millions, Joseph Stalin killed millions, Chairman Mao killed millions. You know, the gas chamber, the gulag. There's very little to choose in reality between those who choose racial pride and those who choose other forms of pride. Both groups full of hatred.
Interestingly, both those groups that seem polar opposites, fascism on the one hand, communism on the other, and leading to the gulags and concentration camps, have one thing in common: that's godlessness.
Absolutely. Atheism, and atheism unites the Nazi and the anti-Nazi, the fascist and the anti-fascist. They're both united by a hatred of God and his church. And the great advantage, or the great opportunity that's presented itself to us now, these are violent and unpleasant times. But if we are really now to practice what we preach, which is to show the alternative of love of neighbor, love of enemy, love of all races and all peoples, as being made in the image of God, the dignity of the human person. If we can practice what we preach now, we will be seen as a voice of sanity and reason amidst the madness of hatred. There's actually a great opportunity to evangelize here, as long as Christians don't lose their head and end up becoming sucked into one of those two extremes.
Well, you just laid your hand on why I'm doing this whole show, Joseph, to step into that void, to bring fides et ratio, you know, faith and reason. There seems to be a terrible dearth of rational, I mentioned logos earlier, that the universe is intelligible if you have eyes to see. If you're not blinded by things like sin and hatred, you can actually find common ground with our enemies. But I think the polarization makes that very hard to do, because I might disagree with someone on the far left. I might think they're wrong. I might want to engage in debate, but they think I'm evil, right, and I need to be purged and silenced, and my statues need to come down. People, I give talks in parishes, and Catholics are very slow to believe that statues of the Blessed Mother and our Lord are next. They are next. They're in the crosshairs because they represent, I mean, they're all lies, but I was thinking about the Blessed Mother, right? She's, I think it's a matter of time before Mary will be seen as some kind of political radical, because she said in the Magnificat, you know, God will cast the mighty down from their thrones, and didn't she step on a lizard from an endangered species? You know, they want to, rather than engage in rational discourse, they want to rage and to silence. That's the troubling part.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and we are living perilously if we don't learn the lessons of history, and we know that the Nazis didn't just persecute the Jews; they persecuted the Christians. We know that the communists, as atheists, outlawed Christianity. That there were hundreds of thousands of Christians lounging, languishing, I should say, in the Gulag in the Soviet Union, or the concentration camps of the Nazis. No, the extreme left and the extreme right have that much in common, that they both hate Christianity, and the history shows that they're iconoclasts. They're quite happy to destroy religious statues, religious buildings, and once we start applauding the putting down of statues, we know where it ends. It ends basically with the destruction of all images that I'm personally opposed to, and my own particular extremist group is personally opposed to. And one thing I find very, very scary at the moment, Patrick, is the way that the liberal media are applauding acts of violence, applauding acts of iconoclasm. They've really shown their true colors, and that might be a good thing. But you know, they're not a wolf in sheep's clothing anymore. They're ravenous wolves, and we can see it. But it's scary when mainstream media applaud iconoclasm and the use of political violence against enemies rather than rational discourse. If someone's ideas are stupid, you should be able to defeat them without having to resort to violence. There's
an American cartoonist named B. Kliban. He's deceased now, Kliban. He used to do these cat calendars. I used to love him when I was a kid. And one of B. Cliben's cartoons was a simple, it's a protest group arguing with another protest group. So each side has placards, okay? On one side, the placards read, "People for against." And the other placard says, "People against for." And they're screaming at each other. Yep. Voila. Alt-right versus Antifa.
Voila, exactly. That cartoon needs to be resurrected, and people need to know it.
I've seen a collage of photos of these Antifa activists once they have their coward masks removed by the police and photographed. And they all have the same vacant, lost, I call it the 1,000-yard stare. And I can't help but think questions like, where are their fathers? You would think of patriotism, right? The Latin root for father, the fatherland we call our countries. Do you think that patriotism that becomes a kind of malevolent nationalism is rooted with a problem with your father? I don't want to psychoanalyze the whole thing into the ground, but is there something there that if your relationship with your earthly father is diseased in some way, we need that father figure, and we're going to go someplace to heal that wound. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed. One of the problems we have at the moment is that the correct answers are not the paths of self-gratification and the paths of least resistance. If you want to be happy, right, you have to have the responsibility of family life. And not just that the fathers are going to be happy if they embrace responsibility of wives and children, and wives will be happy if they do the same thing. So that the point is, in future generations, children that grow up having had a stable family relationship are going to be much happier than those who have come from broken homes. So many of the people that hate the idea of the family have never experienced the idea of the family. They come from broken homes. They hate their fathers, maybe hate their mothers, and therefore they see that what they came from was a mess. And rather than see, well, maybe I should be looking for the way things should be, true idealism. What is love within the context of marriage? Instead of asking those sorts of questions, they say to hell with marriage. And the consequence of that, of course, is we are condemning future generations to more of the very sad, pathetic, broken people. We're going to continue ad nauseum the problem that we have because we're not prepared to ask the difficult questions that are necessary. In other words, we have to preserve and protect and strengthen the traditional family, because that's the only way that future generations will have the happiness and not the brokenness that we see around us today.
Well, you see how it feeds itself, because if you don't have a model of what a good family looks like, then you're mentor free, and so it's very easy to fall into the trap of creating an external chaos to replicate the one you grew up with.
Absolutely. And of course, you're not mentor free. You actually find yourself following demagogues who are very, very nasty. And there's a very, very minor difference between narcissism and Nazism. Basically, that once you become narcissistic, you will destroy anybody that gets in your way, because it's all about you. And so you'll self-identify with other people that agree with you, and will destroy anybody that disagrees with you. And that's where we are now. And it doesn't really matter if the person on the so-called right and the so-called left. Terms, by the way, which I think Christians should avoid using anyway. G.K. Chesterton says that right and left mean nothing. Right and wrong is all that matters.
Do you think a synonym for racism or this virulent nationalism is group narcissism? Yes.
Absolutely, it's group narcissism, and it's pride, it's racial pride, and I think we need to nail pride here, because the Antifas will be on pride parades, and the neo-Nazis are on pride parades, right? The thing they have in common is pride. Now, and it's collective pride. One group have an ideological cohesion, if you like. They cohere according to the shared ideology. The other cohere according to an ideology based upon race. And so the thing they have in common is pride, and the consequence of pride, which is prejudice, and the consequence of prejudice, which is hatred.
We'll take a little break, a little mini breakette. I want to invite you to a special event next year. We'll be back with Joseph Pearce, former neo-Nazi from England, now Catholic biographer, man of letters, and senior editor, just about everywhere. Anything that can be edited, Joseph has probably edited it. This is The Patrick Coffin Show. We'll be right back, and I promise a random reference to stiff little fingers. Don't go away. Most people have a bucket list about where they want to go. And on most people's bucket lists, it's Rome and Catholic Italy. If you're a baptized Catholic at all, you want to go to Rome. You want to see the Holy Father. You want to be there for massive feast days like, Divine Mercy Sunday. Well, I want to invite you next year, April 3rd to the 12th, on a life-changing pilgrimage to Rome. Not just Rome, Assisi, Orvieto, and Siena. Our spiritual director is Father David Genuine. We're going to be there, and you are invited. Go to patrickcoffin.media/Italy, patrickcoffin.media/Italy. Can't wait to get there. We're going to limit it to one bus, and if you sign up before November 3rd, 2017, you save $100. If you pay by check, you save $130. That adds up. So join us to the heart of Catholic Italy. We're going to drink the Italian wine. We're going to taste the food. We're going to pray at these magnificent sites in Rome, Assisi, Siena, and Orvieto, and we want you to be there. patrickcoffin.media/Italy. Hope to see you there. We're back on the Patrick Coffin Show with Joseph Pearce, author of Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. You wrote about kindness to enemies and encounter some people. One of them was Jake Burns, the frontman for the Northern Irish, I guess it'd be Northern Irish, Stiff Little Fingers, new wave punk rock band. How did that encounter happen?
Yeah, that was a very interesting story. I at the time I was the chairman of the Young National Front, so the youth movement of the National Front. I'm guessing it was probably around 1980. We were both guests on a national radio station in the UK. That the BBC has something called BBC Radio 1. And it's the young person's channel. It plays the latest hits and what have you. And they had a sort of a chat show in the evenings. And the topic was immigration or race or something along those lines. Because I was the racist on there, and there was an anti-racist. I can't remember who he was, but Jake Burns was the celebrity. I mean, he was the lead singer of the punk band Stiff Little Fingers. Was for listeners to that particular radio station, everybody would have heard of him as someone famous. So obviously during the live show, I was taking the neo-Nazi position, and Jake Burns and the other chap were obviously opposed to me. And I expect I expect my enemies to hate me. If you like, there's a comfort zone around hatred, right? I hate you, you hate me, we know where we stand. But when you have had an antagonistic radio experience for an hour or so, and afterwards I'm sort of looking and glaring at him, and we're in the reception area of the BBC, then he invites me out for a pint at the local pub. And that is completely disarming. Didn't really know how to deal with it, but I said sure, and so we went there for an hour, and he made a point of being affable, not agreeing with me, but also I think making a point of not being antagonistic. And at the end of it, I was completely disarmed, right? Because my hatred, if you like, had been disarmed by his love, and ever since then, I've sensed this debt of gratitude to him because he taught me something. If you really want to convert people that are full of hatred, you don't smash them in the nose, right? Because you hurt them, but you don't actually destroy their enmity. In fact, they hate you more because you've hurt them. If you really want to change them, to change their ideas and change the way they see things, you have to love them. And it may be easier said than done, but it's the way to do it, which is why the Antifa approach to the neo-Nazis and the neo-Nazi approach to Antifa is the wrong approach, because all it will do is just entrench both in their hatred against each other and the hatred which drives them.
So both positions just ossify and permanentize.
Exactly, and end up basically, as you rightly said earlier, being Siamese twins that basically beat each other's brains out, but have much more in common with each other than either group has with anybody else around them.
Did you ever learn Jake Burns' motive for doing that? Is he a Christian, to your knowledge?
I don't actually know. I don't know much about him, to be honest with you, except that I didn't like him at the time, apart from the fact he played for anti-racist organizations, the Stiff Little Fingers. So he was an enemy on that score, but also he was in favor of peace in Northern Ireland at a time that I was in favor of destroying the enemy.
Sure.
So I liked his music. I bought the albums and I knew the music. You have a disconnect. You can like the music and turn it, and take the lyrics with a grain of salt.
Oh yes, I do that every movie with Hollywood actors and directors. Totally true. Joseph, I want to ask you a question about the modern history, shorthand. The modern history of England, going from Merry England with its noble past and institutions, and the perhaps over-romanticized version of Merry England, with the UK, more secular, more identified with the EU. It's UK. England as UK is not the same as England from your boyhood, is it?
Well, wasn't you threw a curveball at the end there, because that question is very different from the question you asked first on. I mean, let me take both questions and try to give the one minute answer to each. So the history of England, basically, Merry England is the term normally given to medieval England, which was Catholic England. And basically, unlike the Reformation on the continent, which did have a theological component, the Reformation in England was purely secular, was pretty Machiavellian. Henry VIII was sympathized with Catholicism, was opposed to Protestantism, but he had his eyes on the wealth of the church. So the dissolution of the abbeys and the religious houses allowed him to personally become much wealthier and to dole out that wealth to any of his cronies. It was a Machiavellian secular revolution. And that really turned the English against organized religion, because if a state religion is imposed upon you, which was not desired by the English people, it's imposed by big government, you just become cynical towards that state religion. And so England evolved then into a pragmatic utilitarian society that led to the Industrial Revolution, etc. But also around this time, it's when England stops being referred to by the intelligentsia, and they start talking about Britain. And that's partly because the monarchies of Scotland and England came together. But this grew into this idea of Great Britain. So instead of Little England, Great Britain. And this moves us into your second question, because for me, growing up, I was a great Britisher. I was proud of being British because the British had a huge empire, the biggest empire the world's ever known. I flew the Union Jack, which symbolized the unity of Britain, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And that was the union I owed my allegiance to. And a large part of my conversion was a political conversion from if you like, being in love with Great Britain, being a great Britisher, a British imperialist, to become a Little Englander. The one that loves the smallness of my country because it's small, not the greatness of it because it's big. In fact, this is not usual in interviews of this sort, but it's very short. I'm going to just recite a poem of mine, which is a few lines long.
Yeah, by all means. It
encompasses and encapsulates the philosophy of the Little Englander as opposed to the Great Britisher, and it has applicability to the United States, which will be, I hope, implicit. When Britain had an empire, the sun would never set, but the sun set over England, and Englishmen forget that greater than the empire are the rolling Yorkshire moors, and more glorious the dales than all the empire's wars. So I think that really encapsulates the fact that I love my country because the beautiful landscape, the history, the heritage, but not because it's some big powerful force on the world stage, getting its will done.
This reminds me of an appreciation for the E.F. Schumacher book, Small is Beautiful. Schumacher, I think, was a convert, if I'm not mistaken.
He was. Yeah, again, he was another important component in my conversion. The idea of his book, Small is Beautiful, which was an international million seller. Now, for a book of economics to become a New York Times bestseller, international bestseller, is very unusual. But it's published in 1973, and it was a game changer. It did cause a seismic shift in the way that people understood the economy on all sorts of grounds. But for me, it was part of that conversion towards the idea of the small and beautiful, from the small and beautiful family, small and beautiful business, small and beautiful countries, as opposed to big empires. not just political empires, but economic empires, global corporations, etc. So this love for the local, this love for the small and the beautiful, was a large part of my conversion to Catholicism. And Schumacher, as you rightly say, was a convert to Catholicism because he was a convert from Marxism. He was a Marxist economist, and then he was introduced to the Catholic social encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII and the 11th. And he realized that the Catholic Church had got it right, whereas all the conventional economists had got it wrong.
This is an important point, Joseph, because people, I know a lot of conservatives of a certain sort, Catholics in America, they see the world through a binary lens. You've got laissez-faire capitalism, which they really like, which is usury-based. And then they've got communism, which they really hate. It doesn't compute that Catholic social teaching offers a third way, and not something that contains the errors of both, but a different vision of the relationship between one's salary and taxation and private property. It's not easy to summarize. That's the problem with Catholic social teaching. It's a whole body. It's like, how do you summarize theology of the body in one sentence? Catholic social teaching is it synonymous, do you think, with this Chestertonian, Bellockian distributism? Are there some differences?
There were some nuanced differences. I would say I would put it this way, that Catholic social teaching, based upon the concepts of subsidiarity and solidarity, is what it's about, and distributism, the Chestertons and Bellocks take on it, emphasize one particular aspect to achieve those goals, which was the necessity of having widely distributed private property. So that became their focus, but that's not the sole focus of Catholic social teaching. So it'd be better to say that distributism is a part of Catholic social teaching, but not necessarily completely synonymous with it.
How do you think the Catholic intellectual tradition, for lack of a better phrase, or the Catholic lens, I mentioned earlier, fides et ratio, faith and reason, how does that offer an answer to this extreme polarization, this racial hatred? What the Catholic vision, what does it offer that's utterly unique?
Well, again, these times of political polarization, where, if you like, materialism and relativism breaks down in its own too much. It's basically it's in the process of unraveling, of decaying, of collapsing, which is going to be messy and violent, which is unpleasant for everybody. But it does present, and again, history shows us this, great opportunities for new evangelization. For the Catholic Church, first of all, to be seen as the only authentic love between the extremes of hatred. But also how that love plays itself out in terms of economics and politics, that we need to have an economics and politics which is closer to the family, closer to the locality, so we want small government instead of big government. We want small businesses instead of big government, big business. We don't want a globalized economy, which will basically be a globalized political empire. And this is one of the problems for those that advocate untrammeled laissez-faire, is that when you leave things alone, you just leave the big boys to do what they like. And that will also include the destruction of the United States in terms of national sovereignty, because we're going to have a global economy run by a global empire that will swallow up the United States as it's swallowing up all the other countries.
Were you surprised by the Brexit vote?
Astonished, and very pleasantly astonished. I was convinced. I knew that the British people did not like the European Union because it's corrupt. It's a corrupt, giant bureaucracy, undemocratic. But I thought that the whole campaign of the Remain campaign to try to persuade people to stay in was fear. That, okay, we know the European Union is not good. So no one was trying to even pretend that the European Union was good. But it's the best case scenario, because if you pull out, you're all going to lose your jobs. You're going to be bankrupt and homeless. In other words, pure fear. And unfortunately, I had such a low opinion of human nature that I assumed that the British people would succumb to the fear and, with their tails between their legs, be whipped into obedience. And so I was very pleasantly astonished when they voted for their freedom.
You have to think that the ascendancy of President Trump had something to do with sparking that British patriotism as apart from the EU. If we had President Hillary Clinton, I wonder if the vote would have gone differently. Because think of what the average British media consumer was facing. a barrage of BBC propaganda and the fear mongering and sure, it's not perfect, but it's the only thing we have, and what will we do on our own, and so on. It overcame an awful lot to get to the vote that it did.
Yeah, I think in terms of history, however, Brexit preceded Trump's election.
You do.
So I think it would be more true to say that there was a genuine populist uprising against the ideology of secular fundamentalism and globalism. And again, what's really ironic here, of course, there's so many ironies, Patrick. It's comic that the anarchists of Antifa are opposed to globalism. Very probably the neo-Nazis are opposed to globalism. The Catholic Church is opposed to globalism. In other words, if we could actually start looking at what the real big enemies is instead of hating each other, and see that basically we're being shepherded into a system where there's going to be, if things don't intervene, there's going to be a one world government which will be anything but a democracy, where the biggest of governments the world has ever seen will be in bed with the biggest of businesses the world's ever seen, and the result is that ordinary people on the streets are completely disenfranchised and are slaves. If we could actually start looking at the real threats out there instead of screaming abuse at each other, we might actually make some progress in the genuine resistance to something that's worth resisting.
It all makes you wonder how much of this is a dress rehearsal for the coming of the Antichrist, frankly.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I'm always wary of predicting the end times, not least because, again, the more you understand history, the more you realize that the Antichrist is with us all the time. In one sense, certainly if you want to see Satan as the Antichrist, that evil is ever present in the world. It's not omnipresent in the way that God is, because there will be no evil in heaven. But in this world, it's there. It's part of the very fallen fabric of the cosmos in which we live. And that's why Tolkien talks about history being the long defeat with only occasional glimpses of final victory.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a great insight.
Yeah, if you went back to England in the late 1500s, where priests were being butchered slowly before finally mercifully dying, and where people were being put to death, again, cruelly and in a tortured way for even hiding Catholic priests, you would be, thinking the world's coming to an end there,
yeah,
or the Reformation, or et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, the church is always with us, and the gates of hell won't prevail, as we know, and that's our hope. And with the church, there's no need ever to despair.
One last question: how do you distinguish between nationalism and patriotism?
Very dangerous to go into that semantic direction. There's a priest I know very well, a good friend, who's saying that patriotism is good, nationalism is bad. I think it's dangerous because that it was the Edith Cavell, a British war heroine who was shot for spying during World War I, said that patriotism is not enough. That yes, loving your country is good, but as Chesterton said, saying my country right or wrong is like saying my mother drunk or sober. If we love our country, we don't follow her when she's involved in a drunken debauch. We work to correct her, even if it seems to be, in the eyes of the majority, unpatriotic. And for me, nationalism, it depends. For me, Polish nationalism against the Soviet Union was good, right? That wanting to resurrect the Polish nation as a bastion for Catholicism against the totalitarianism of Soviet communism is a good thing. Obviously, the nationalism of the Nazis is a bad thing. I think the most important thing is for us to understand that when a nationalism starts talking about imposing its will on other nations, it's no longer nationalism, it's internationalism, it's imperialism. So when Hitler marches into Poland, he's becoming an imperialist. Yes. And an imperialist is always an internationalist, and an internationalist cannot be at the same time a nationalist.
That's a nice way to put a bow on it. It leads me to another question, but I promise that would be the last one. Okay, just question 1.5. Colonialism is therefore somewhat of a synonym for imperialism. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, no, you're right. Basically, the colonialism for the most part was driven by economic gain on the part of those countries that had the technology that enabled them to impose their will upon other nations. And we should get one thing perfectly clear here. Colonialism is a product of the Industrial Revolution, which was a product of the Enlightenment, which was a product of rebellion against the church. So when in the reductionism of the anti-Christians, that they see somehow that the Catholicism is bound up with the racism of colonialism, they're getting things exactly back to front. That basically it was the turning away from the church that led to the secularism that led to colonialism.
Great spot for, I won't say a period, maybe a semicolon. So you'll come back and we'll do a long form interview. We can talk about Francis Thompson and Roy Campbell and the death and maybe the rising of poetry. So much to talk about, including Oscar Wilde. Joseph Pearce, thank you so much for all the work that you do. All the things you say and write are always terrific food for thought for starters. So thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Patrick. It's great to be with you, and let's do it again.
All right. I'd recommend you start with Charlottesville Through the Eyes of an Ex-White Supremacist, published in August of 2017 at the National Catholic Register. You'd also love his book, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde. This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?